Hello, welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, today's chapters are Zechariah chapters 7 and 8. Now, in Zechariah 7, a delegation came to Jerusalem with a question about fasting. And at this point, I think the temple was about halfway completed. And they had a custom at the time to fast in commemoration of the destruction of the temple. So it was like this lamenting, fasting, oh, our temple's been broken. But now they've halfway through construction of it. And so Zechariah says to them as an answer from the Lord, when you fasted and mourned the 5th and 7th month, that's because of the destruction of the temple, these past 70 years while they were in exile. Was it really for me that you fasted? Was it really? Or will you just get this religious thing going, this lament going? This is what the Lord Almighty says. Administer true justice. Show mercy and compassion to one another. This business about wailing and mourning and about something lost, that's not as important as the justice and the kindness that you express to each other. He says, this is what I've been trying to get across to you. And then in verse 11 it says, and your predecessors have stubbornly blocked their ears, turned their backs, and made their hearts hard as flint, it says in verse 12. And so I scattered them. So he says, you want to talk to me about fasting? It's not really about fasting. It's about how you live out your life in faith for me. Anyway, in Zechariah 8, Zechariah changes the way he's addressing the people, and he says, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I am very zealous for Zion. In other words, he says, I love you with all my heart. I am burning with jealousy for her. In other words, I guard the relationship we had jealously. He says, I will return to Zion and dwell in Jerusalem. God says, I myself, I'm coming by my presence among my people, and that's going to change them, which is what Paul promises in Corinthians, doesn't he? He says, now we're all being transformed, like with unveiled faces, from one degree of glory to another, by the Spirit of the Lord. The Holy Spirit changes us. As we encounter him, as we spend time with him, as we worship him, as we have fellowship and allow him into our lives, he transforms us. And that was his promise over his people. And then he says this is the promise. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Once again, men and women of ripe old age will sit in the streets of Jerusalem. I've got this shooting stick. Some of you might never have seen this before if you're not into cricket, but umpires used to sit on this. But it's a great thing to go for walks with. You can sit, and that's what I do. I sit on this shooting stick, and every time I do so, I think, boy, I'm getting old. And this is what he says. My people, Jerusalem is going to be filled with old people, like walking around with canes. Why would he have said that? You see, it would have been difficult for old people to come back to Jerusalem from exile. It's a hangover walk. So when the exiles came back, the strong and the able, they came back, but would have been very few frail people. He says, look, it's going to happen. It's going to happen once again. There are going to be children on the streets, and there's going to be the aged in the streets too. Streets filled with boys and girls playing here. And he says, I will save my people from the countries on the east and the west. This is what it's going to be like. Now, obviously, he's talking about Jerusalem being filled again, the temple being filled again. But there's also an allusion, a pointing to the kingdom that Jesus is going to rule for all eternity. And so if you read the rest of it like that, it's Jerusalem being full, but also heaven and the new heaven and the new earth. It's absolutely beautiful. This is what he says. In those days, 10 people from all languages and nations will take hold of one Jew by the hem of the robe and say, let us go with you, because we've heard about your God. And what's he's talking about there? He's talking about all nations coming to God through the Messiah, Jesus. All of us grabbing hold of the hem. And what's he talking about? He's basically saying Jesus is going to come. It's going to make possible that all nations could come and share in this glorious rule under Jesus.